Try as I might, I can't help but get a little bit attached to my long-termers, and over the last 5 months, I've really gotten to know this Nissan X-Trail. Like the twin under the skin Mitsubishi Outlander that I had before it, it's done over 10,000 Ks in our tenure. I've gone everywhere from Brisbane, the Snowy Mountains, and even Adelaide. Though perhaps its greatest challenge has been to serve as a family car every single day. Now, for our long-term test, we chose the Ti variant, which is the second from the top, and specifically in the E-Power guise. And after so long on the road, I have a lot of thoughts about this car, both good and bad, and today I'm going to take you through them all. We're going to talk about fuel economy, wear and tear, the driving experience, both on the bitumen and on the dirt, and ultimately I'm going to tell you if I think this is a car that you should buy. Now, before we get started in today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe and comment down below if you want to see more content like this. Chasing cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. Now, for my first point, let's talk about fuel economy, which I'm going to say is somewhat of a bad mark on the X-Trail, and I'm going to explain why in just a second. Now, during my time with this car, I've really come to love the hybrid system. It's one of my favorite parts about it. And that's not just because of the driving experience, which I'll touch on later, but also because of how interesting it is. Now, in a traditional hybrid, you essentially have an electric motor and the petrol engine, and they take turns when you're driving along. However, with the X-Trail E-Power system, it's better thought of as a fully electric vehicle, which has a very small battery, which is constantly recharged by the 1.5 litre 3-cylinder engine up the front. So let's talk figures. Now, over our total driving distance, we saw an average of 7.4 litres per 100 Ks. And I'm just going to break down those figures a little bit because, interestingly, unlike a normal petrol or diesel car, this is less efficient when you go on the highway compared to urban conditions. So, for example, when you're driving in urban conditions, we've seen about 5.8 litres per 100 Ks, whereas on the highway, it's been closer to about 7.8 litres per 100 Ks. So as you can tell, I have done a bit more highway driving as part of our tenure, and I also do a bit of highway driving in my everyday commute. So it does add up in that respect. And if I'm honest, I was a little bit disappointed, particularly in those highway range figures. We're not always talking 110 here. We're talking generally above 80 kilometers an hour. And I do think that there are some diesel cars out there which would certainly use a lot less fuel than this. And it is worth mentioning that it requires 95 octane in order to run properly, though you can put 91 in a pinch. So that's certainly nice to have. Now, 7.4 litres per 100 Ks is hardly a disastrous fuel consumption figure, but the reason I mark it down overall as a negative for the X-Trail is I think we should be seeing some more improvement in this day and age. Hybrids have been around for many years now. And as a bit of context, a few years ago, we had a Toyota RAV4 hybrid long-termer, and we saw an average of 6 litres per 100 Ks. And for a bit of context, that was a bit more with an urban skew, whereas this was with a bit of a highway skew to its range. But even if I was doing a lot more urban driving, I don't think we would have been able to see those fuel consumption figures that we saw out of the RAV4. And you know, I think it's time for hybrids to improve just a little bit again. In saying that, if you are dead set on getting an X-Trail, it's worth noting that this does show a marketed difference over the petrol variant, where it's 2.5 litre 4-cylinder engine. When I was testing the STL all-wheel drive version previously, I saw 8.4 litres per 100 Ks in combined conditions. So you are seeing an improvement there. So that brings me to my next good point for the X-Trail, and that is that this is simply a very good family car. I've really enjoyed using it because it's quite logical in how it's laid out. You have a good amount of buttons up here, some for the multimedia, a huge touchscreen display, and you have the separate climate control buttons down here. Very easy to use, very intuitive. I've never really had to go hunting for anything in particular, except for there was one time which I had to look in the book to find out that the mirrors heat up when you use the windscreen demister, but perhaps that's just me. Anyway, apart from that, we do have a good amount of interior storage as well. That's been very useful. You've got your standard cup holders here. You've got a wireless phone charger, which you get on the Ti grade, bottle holders in the doors, but you also get the extra storage here under the center console, which isn't something you see on all cars. It's certainly something that I came to appreciate a lot about this car. In terms of outright negatives about this interior, there's only a few really. I think you could have some more support built into the seats. You don't get a cooled seat option anywhere in the X-Trail range, which I think is a bit of a miss in Australia. And finally, the 6-speaker stereo option that you get on the base grade all the way up to the Ti that I'm in now is not very good. Very flat sound, and I didn't enjoy it much at all. You do get a 10-speaker Bose system, but that's only on the Ti L grade. And you know, I'm not sure that that one's worth the extra spend. But in all other areas, this cabin has been really impressive, and that extends to the back seat, which I've particularly enjoyed because I could have a rearwards facing baby seat in there with my little one, and I didn't have to move my wife's seat forward and compromise her natural relaxation position, which is, something you certainly want to retain when you're going on long journeys, which we've done a lot in this car. It's also really easy to fit those baby seats because you do have the rear doors that open all the way up to 85 degrees. That's a pretty significant angle, and one that's made fitting baby seats, which I have done honestly probably over 100 times in this car because I'm always chopping in and out of cars. Really quite easy in this X-Trail. So top marks for that. So let's talk about wear and tear, which overall I'm going to mark down as a good point for the X-Trail. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to talk about a few different sections of the car. So a big wear point in a lot of cars is the side bolstering of the driver's seat. This car has over 17,000 Ks on it. I've done 10,000 of those, and overall I'm not seeing a huge amount of collapsing on this bolstering, which is really encouraging to see. If you also look to the door sill down here, I do notice that there is a slight indentation for my habit of putting my elbow up here a lot in traffic or where I'm hanging onto the wheel. So that's something to note. I do notice that it bounces back after a while, but even looking at it now, it does seem to be a bit of a mark laid into the rubber there. So that's a bit of a wait and see, that one. Now, I hesitate to mention this one, but it's something which I haven't been able to unnotice as soon as I did notice it. And that's the fact that this steering wheel, well, when I do this, it makes a strange noise. I don't know if you can hear that on the camera, but it's a bit of a buzzing sound that I was really concerned about when I first got into the car. You usually want to make sure everything's right with the steering wheel, pretty important component in a car. But it doesn't seem to make any noise when I've gone over some rough dirt roads or anything like that. It's pretty steadfast, it doesn't make a noise. So really all I think it is a bit of an impromptu musical instrument. And I did notice that when I got into the Qashqai that they also have this noise. So maybe that's just a tolerance thing that Nissan has at their level. Now, the next part I'm going to talk about is the center console piece. And this was something that I was particularly impressed by when I first got into the X-Trail, because I think it's quite clever design. It's this plastic componentry which is kind of made to look like brushed aluminium. Some people might think it's a little bit tacky. I can see how they get there, but I think it has another purpose in that it seems to be a little bit more wear resistant than some other materials used out there, and particularly black gloss material, which I did have in my old Mitsubishi Outlander long-termer, and that did show signs of wear, whereas this doesn't really show signs of wear, and I think it's really down to that material choice. So bravo to Nissan for that one. The last one I'm going to talk about is on the back seat, and that is the point of the seat where the top tether goes over the seat and then connects to the baby seat. I've had the baby seat in there most of the time, and of course when my child is in there, it's pulled tight down over the seat. So it's pretty normal to see some bending in the shape of the seat there from long-term use. And having a look at back there now, I'm not really seeing a whole lot of wear. Sure, there is some, but it could certainly be worse. And I think the last point that really solidifies the fact that the X-Trail is a good family car is the fact that this is a very safe vehicle, and particularly when it comes to children. For example, in the 5-star ANCAP score, which was tested back in 2021, they scored a 90% for child occupant protection, which is pretty darn good. It also gets some modern innovations like reversing AEB, which is really great to have with kids. And up front here, you get a front center airbag, which is really great to try and prevent some of those side-on collisions in a side-on impact. So certainly great to have. But of course, we can't talk about practicality without talking about the boot. You get a power tailgate on the TI grade, which is a nice upgrade over the STL, and it opens up to reveal a 575 litre boot, which is a figure that I still don't like quoting because it's a metric which applies to the roof line, not the window line like is commonplace in a lot of rivals. So one to watch out for if you're comparing this against other vehicles. Now in the middle, you'll see they've got the cargo blind here, which I've only recently taken out of my garage, dusted off its cobwebs, because quite frankly, it was a little bit of an inconvenience. An unfortunate casualty of the hybrid system is that you're no longer able to store this under the floor here because of all the extra equipment in the way. So quite frankly, that just went in my garage pretty much immediately. But apart from that, look, I've really grown to love the boot on this thing. And that's not necessarily because of its base dimensions. That's because the second row, it has the ability to slide forward, and quite significantly slide forward actually. And on those occasions, like when I went to Adelaide recently and had to come home with a car chock full of presents and other things, including a bike, I had it all crammed in here quite easily. And without that ability, I think it would have been more of a case of folding down the seats, which I don't really like to do personally because I like to have a bit of a barrier between me and the cargo. that might just be me, but even in everyday situations, I was able to move that second row forward, which allowed me to have the baby seat still in place and also another adult behind my own driving position while still having extra room in the boot. A really fantastic feature that I'd love to see in more cars. Look, there are some other small criticisms, like I would like to have the ability to fold down the seats completely via a latch here in the boot. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We've got tie down points and we do have a little bit of underfloor storage here. And really, as a family car, I think this is one of the most crucial locations. But taking all that into consideration, I think the boot on the X-Trail is pretty darn good. Now, some of you might think I'm being a little bit over the top with this next one, but in a country like Australia, a land of long distances, I don't think this is anything to dismiss. And that is the complete lack of a spare tyre in the X-Trail, space saver or otherwise. Interestingly, when you go from the petrol, you do have a space saver spare, and that is with 7 seats in the back. But as soon as you put the hybrid in there, you do lose that entirely. You just got your packet of goo. And I like the downsides of this the hard way pretty darn quickly. A bit over 10 kilometers with this car. I already had a puncture in this wheel and I had to go get it replaced. Had to put it on the tow truck because it was on the sidewall. Didn't really want to drive it and risk anything. And so they had to go get replaced the hard way. And the unfortunate side of this is that it's not just the X-Trail which is the culprit of this, of ditching its spare tyre as soon as a hybrid system goes in. I've looked at just about every mid-size SUV I can find, and including everything up to the brand new Honda CR-V, which is only a 5-seat and front-wheel drive, not even an electric motor on the rear axle or a drive shaft, you still don't get a spare tyre, just a packet of goo. And honestly, I really think that that's a shame. There is, however, one exception to all those cars, and that is the Toyota RAV4. It's the only one with a spare tyre and a hybrid system. I really think that's something that needs to improve over the next generation of hybrids.
Thankfully, there has been some progress on this front in recent months, with Korean rivals such as the Kia Sportage offering a space saver spare in its front-wheel drive hybrid option. Also, the closely related Hyundai Tucson hybrid will soon make its debut in Australia, and it will be available with a space saver spare in all options, including the all-wheel drive configuration.
Now, how about time for something a little bit different that you may not see in every SUV review, and let's talk about dirt driving. Now, as much as I love the idea, the X-Trail is simply not a miniaturized version of the Patrol. So I don't expect this to be tackling the Victorian high country, but I do expect it to be able to take on some high-speed dirt country roads and also the odd bumpy hiking trail. After all, this is an SUV, and let's also not forget that 60% of the roads in this country are unsealed, so this should offer some sort of competitive edge, let's say over a hatchback or a sedan in those situations, at least in theory. It's also worth pointing out that Nissan's own marketing does indeed have an X-Trail traversing a mountain in the middle of nowhere, and there's actually talk of a warrior version in the same vein of the Patrol or the Navara being made available of the X-Trail, and that to me sounds really exciting. And it also says to me that Nissan thinks that there is a bit of talent under the skin of this X-Trail. So as this was a car that I was living with every day, I wanted to treat it like my personal vehicle. And one of the things that I love doing in my personal time is going camping. So one weekend I went out with some friends who had some real four-wheel drives, and we went out to the snowy mountains. And it was a good test for this X-Trail, I think. I had a boot full of camping gear, and it was a good mixture of some more technical terrain where you had to be careful, but it wasn't anything too extreme, and some high-speed dirt road sections which you'll find in the country fairly regularly. So how did it go? Well, generally I've got to say I was fairly impressed. One thing to note about the E-Power variant compared to the petrol one is that it has 18mm less ground clearance at 187mm. So nothing mega like the Subaru Forester, which has some pretty mega ground clearance and really does lead that class. So when I say it did well, I mean not just in the most literal sense, but also that it was fairly easy to negotiate, and that's thanks to a few separate things. First of all, it does have 2 separate off-road modes, and it has hill descent control, the latter of which I found worked really quite well. The off-road mode is often a bit of a joke on some SUVs. It doesn't really do all that much, but I did find a meaningful difference on this X-Trail E-Power. And the main thing it did was it adjusted the throttle calibration so it was a little bit less aggressive, so you could be more careful when navigating those trickier sections. Another thing that was also really handy was the 360 camera. Now this has been very helpful in parking all sorts of crazy car parks over the last 5 months, but it also came in quite handy here. You don't just have a bird's eye view, you also have a fairly close-up front camera, so you're able to spot those bigger rocks and then get the hell out the way, essentially. Another thing that really helped the experience was the 19-inch wheels. Now the grades below it, they come with 18s, and you do have 20s at the very top spec, but I have always thought the 19s were a good balance, and that continues for this situation. I was able to take a few PSI out of them, make them a little bit more soft, a little bit more forgiving in these conditions, and give me a little bit extra traction while still having plenty of protection for the wheels. So that was quite nice as well. But what about when it came to the higher speed red dirt conditions? Well, this thing also performed pretty well. The traction control does lean on the more conservative side, as you would expect for a family SUV like this one. While perhaps not personally to my taste, I like a little bit more rotation, as I feel a little bit more in control instead of more understeery. I think it was a good balance for this car, and it was fairly confidence inspiring. So look, all in all, I was pretty impressed with the X-Trail when it came to those off-road conditions. It's got trail in the name, right? So it should be fairly competent, and I was pleased to see that that was the case.
So what's it like to drive the Nissan X-Trail E-Power day in, day out on the roads that you're probably going to spend a lot more time on? I'm talking commuting, long distances, and even some performance and fun driving. Well, overall, I've got to say this has been a huge positive for the X-Trail, and it's been one of my favorite parts of the experience. And a lot of that is down to the e-Power system. I spent a significant amount of time in the 2.5 litre naturally aspirated petrol versions, and I must say the e-Power system is just significantly more refined. And that's down to not just the way it works, which is really quite clever, but I also think the merits of this hybrid system in particular. In comparison to some other hybrid systems out there, like for example the CR-V or even the Toyota RAV4, which is more of a traditional hybrid system, the Nissan's is just significantly more refined at a greater range of engine speeds. And one of its real benefits is the fact that if you're stepping on the accelerator and you need a little bit more power, or you're going up a big hill, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a wave of clattery engine noise through the cabin. And that's because not only is the petrol engine just a bit more hush than some other hybrid systems out there, but also the fact that it's a really clever little petrol engine. It's only a 3-cylinder, and it's backed by a turbocharger, which naturally does make things a little bit more quiet. And overall, I think it comes together to make a hybrid system which is really quite fun and pokey, but also fairly refined at a greater range of everyday speed. So a great mark for Nissan there. I will say in terms of other aspects of the driving experience, the suspension hits a nice balance between having competent body control and also a good amount of comfort across a range of conditions, and the safety systems I found to be fairly well tuned. If I was to point out a few negatives though, I will say that I'd like to see some more soundproofing around the cabin of the X-Trail. Even if the engine in this hybrid system isn't all that loud, the wind noise was quite noticeable at higher speeds. The steering is fairly numb, although that's not a huge deal, and I will say that you do hit the dynamic limits of this car quickly, which may not be a big deal to everyone, but if you want something with more of a dynamic edge, I'd definitely look more to something like a Volkswagen Tiguan. There was, however, one unfortunate negative that we did experience with the X-Trail over the many kilometers and months that we spent with this car, and other journalists also did notice this when they took the wheel from time to time, and that was what I come to call the throttle pulsing issue. And essentially this occurred mainly at highway speeds when we were going up gradients for long periods of time. Nothing quite like a steep driveway, but certainly something you might come across when going through the hills or even the city highways of Sydney and Melbourne. Essentially this would behave similar to turning a blender off and on at the wall, in that it felt like there wasn't always a steady flow of electricity being sent to the electric motors. Now, I'm not really sure what this specifically is. I do suggest it might be simply a calibration issue to do with the electric motors and how much electricity they're being fed in a mission, I would say, to try and be a bit more fuel efficient, similar to when you might put your petrol car in eco mode. However, the feeling was a bit more abrupt because it is an electric motor and it has very much an off and on nature. And while I wouldn't say it's a significant issue overall, it did unfortunately dampen the overall great refinement that the X-Trail does have, and I hope that Nissan can find a fix for this issue.
So after 5 months and 10,000 kilometers on the road, do I think this Nissan X-Trail E-Power is worth its circa $55,000 asking price, and would I personally consider one to buy? Well, the answer is yes. And the reason for that is that this is a car which has really grown on us here at Chasing Cars. From its practicality, its no-nonsense cabin usability, the driving experience and its safety, while none of these things may be particularly segment-leading, altogether they make for a car which is very good to actually own and live with. And although the e-Power system may not reach the fuel economy figure heights of the segment-leading Toyota RAV4 hybrid, I do think it offers an advantage when it comes to driving refinement, because simply that engine is a lot less noisy than the one in the Toyota RAV4. And also, for a $4,200 upcharge in the Ti and Ti L grade, or just a $3,200 upcharge on the STL grade, I certainly think this is a good and worthwhile upgrade over the 2.5 litre petrol engine, which is getting a little bit long in the tooth now. Another advantage of the Nissan over the Toyota model is the fact that it's probably going to be a heck of a lot easier to get your hands on one. Personally, I've spoken to several dealers who have told me that I can get one just like this in e-Power guise today, not in a few months' time, today. Though certainly I have heard that the Ti L models are a little bit harder to get, so it might be worth considering if you want to go to the STL or the Ti. Personally, I do think the Ti is worth the extra spend over the lower grade. However, it's worth checking out the STL simply because of its quite enticing sub $50,000 price point before on roads. You still get a lot of nice features like heated seats and those synthetic leather seats, which are decently nice, though you do forego things like the heads-up display and the larger screen in this model, so worth considering, I think. So those have been my thoughts after living with this X-Trail for several months, and I'm really keen to hear what you guys have to say about it. Do you own one of these personally, and do you agree with my good or bad points? Let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this video if you want to see more content like this. But for now, that's all. Thank you for watching Chasing Cars.